I'm Kimberly C. Paul. As I travel throughout each state, I realize that death is just a moment. It is how we live until that moment that matters. Finding connection with friends, family, and complete strangers. Journey with me. This is the Live Well, Die Well Tour. Well, I'm really glad to be talking to Jane Duncan Rogers today. A few weeks ago, I was able to see your TEDx talk, and being a TEDx kind of gone through that process, I was so excited to hear that I was selected, but then I was scared to, can I use death? Because of the process. So talk to me a little bit about your TED Talk and how that evolved for you.
Yes, well, thank you. It's called How to Do a Good Death, and I was invited to give this talk. And I knew at the time that I was going to say yes, and I knew that I would be terrified when it came to it, and I was. But, you know, being scared of things had never really stopped me doing things. So that was kind of par for the course. And I started it by something very similar to yours, actually, because I started by talking about the elephant in the room, because the elephant in the room possibly has got a little bit smaller now, you know, since the pandemic, but it's still there. It's still there a lot. And I felt I wanted to tell my story, my personal story, and how important it is for people to start talking about death, and then on the back of those conversations take some actions. And that's really what the talk was about.
And it was lovely, by the way. I thought I really enjoyed your story, and it kind of opens up that, you know, that's what we also have in common, is that we are brought to this field that we find ourselves in by stories.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about what brought you here, because it was your husband, Philip.
Yes, it was. Well, Philip he was diagnosed with stomach cancer in 2010. And initially we thought that was not, you know, going to be completely life-threatening, because they said if they get all the tumour out and it was caught quite early, then he would have a prognosis of 20 years. And he was, you know, just under 60, I think, at that point. So this was quite good. But actually, he had chemo, he had the operation, but it didn't work in that they didn't manage to get everything out. So suddenly we were faced with the fact that actually he wasn't going to be around very much longer. And he died within 14 months of the diagnosis. But what had happened was, about maybe 5 months or so before he actually died, I had received an email from a friend saying, you must get Philip to answer all these questions before he dies. I don't think she'd put it quite as blunt as that. But anyway, the questions were really quite hard hitting, like, what kind of coffin do you want? What are your passwords? How do you want your body to be dressed? And, you know, really practical things. Now, I ignored that email, and I ignored the second one that came as well, and the third one. And eventually I said to Philip, look, we have to just answer these questions, because she's going to be on our back otherwise. So we sat up in bed one morning with the laptop and the questions, and I typed his answers to the questions. And it was 2 or 3 hours of actually a really creative time. It felt like it was one of our, well, as it turned out, it was our last project together. And we'd been really good at doing projects together, like doing up houses and writing books together and working together and everything. So it was a surprise that we felt that we were talking about his death, and yet we were feeling so close and so loving. And it was just amazing, actually, really amazing. So that, and then, yes, he did die, and it did help me. Now, I tell a little story about this, because he had answered the question about what he wanted his body to be dressed in. And it's not something that I would have thought of, because he said he wanted to be dressed in his dressing gown. Now, his dressing gown is one that I had made for him. So that made sense, but I wouldn't have thought of that. And when the undertaker, who came to the house after Philip had died, when the undertaker asked me about this, it felt so good to be able to say what I knew. And I think we underestimate how important that kind of thing is. The feeling that you get when you know that you're carrying out somebody else's wishes around in whatever aspect it is of death. But in this case, it was this one. And it really helped. It really consoled me, if you like, at a time where I was just devastated. Even though I knew it was coming, I was utterly devastated.
It's like you were still connected, though,
Yeah.
because you knew what his wishes were. And it was almost like a bridge of connection, because these people who were coming in didn't know him, and you knew exactly what he wanted. It must have brought so much comfort to you.
Yeah, it did. It was comforting, and all the questions that we had answered had that effect, actually, because it made me feel safe. There was one that I wrote about in my first book, which we hadn't taken care of, though, which was that after, maybe it was about 2 weeks after he had died, and somebody had been with me all the time. Philip and I had never had children, so I was left on my own. But I had a friend stay, and then she left. And I came back from the airport that evening, and it wasn't very nice to come to an empty house, but there I was. And that evening I sat down, I switched on the television, and it didn't come on to the normal guide screen that I was used to. So she must have been watching it or something. And I could not get it back to that. I couldn't get it to the program that I wanted to watch. And I was so upset, because normally I would have just said, Philip, can you sort this out, please? And I didn't know what to do. So now, with the work that I do, that kind of detail is what I ask people to think about in advance, because it doesn't sound very much, but at the time, oh God, I was in floods of tears and couldn't think straight anyway. Even, if I could have followed instructions, but there weren't any. I couldn't find any instructions. Sounds mad when I say about it now. Every time I say this, it sounds mad. But...
Well, I think it's those little things that remind you of, hey, Philip, can you help me? And Philip is no longer there.
Yeah.
And it's that empty space that feels so, oh man, empty.
I know.
So let's talk about, that conversation. You didn't want to have it.
No.
And you were sort of, your friend was like nudging you. And how grateful are you?
Oh, incredibly grateful. She was a nurse specialist. She knew that these things were going to make a big difference to me. And when I read them, I could see that they would make a big difference to me as well. The level of detail and the thinking that had to go into it. But, talking about all these specific things with somebody who's actually dying, who knows that they're dying, that is, I'm a pretty courageous person, but it really took me all my courage and more to say to Philip, actually, we are going to do this now. And to not go down the emotional route, and to not allow the tears. I didn't feel tearful, funnily enough. I was afraid of doing it. But once we got going, it was okay. So if you like, the fear of it was worse than the actual doing of it, as in so many cases with fear, of course. So I am hugely grateful to her, hugely grateful, because that initial conversation has been what has guided me, in fact, for the rest of my life since then, in terms of the business that I'm now doing. So yeah, amazing. And that TEDx.
I love it. And I love that you share that, because so many people are afraid to begin the conversation, and yet it's so rewarding on the other side. And you're right. It did inspire you to do. And I find this very curious, because there's a lot of people that say, oh, I want to write a book, and they never do. And I want to do this, and they never do. You actually took your husband's death and created a pathway for other people to engage in these very hard conversations. And it's before I go solutions. So what motivated you from thinking about this to actually doing it? Because that to me is rare.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I had I had been practicing as a small business coach, and I had a blog, and I loved to write. I've always loved to write, just like stories when I was a kid, that sort of thing. But I was writing a blog, regular blog for my clients and people then, about business stuff. And after Philip died, well, actually, in that whole year, I had been journaling a lot. I've always journaled all my life, and pen and paper journaling.
Me too. Me too. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. But I have found it very, very useful for processing things. But I knew at some point that I would write the story of this. Now, at the point when I say I knew that I would do that, I didn't know that I was going to publish a book and it would become what it has now become. But at the time, I knew that I was going to write. And I also knew that I just had to wait and wait and wait and trust that I would know when the time was right. And I did. And it was 2.5 years later. And I literally, it's just like in the novels, I woke up one morning and I thought, oh, now's the time. And I started. I made a little mind map. I was on holiday at that time. I didn't have a computer. I made a little mind map. When I came back home, I waited again and again. One morning I woke and there I had done my plan. I had just started writing and it all poured out. Quite cathartic, because I had to go back and look at my journals to see what I had written. And what an interesting thing there. I don't very often talk about this, but this was like 2.5 years on. Maybe, about 2.5 years on. And I was going back to the very raw emotion of those early days. And I could see that I had moved on. Because I didn't feel like that anymore. And I'd forgotten how awful I felt. But there it was, black and white and lots of red as well, on the page. And that was very helpful, actually, because it was a demonstration to me that people do get through grief and move forward in different ways. So then I published the book, self-published the book, Gifted by Grief. And I thought, I'd had quite a lot of insights and spiritual awakenings and this sort of stuff. And I thought that's what people would like. And that wasn't what they responded to. They responded to the chapter where I had written about these questions that I'd asked Philip. And after about the 6th or the 8th or 10th person who said, oh my God, I need to answer these questions too, I sort of went, oh, all right, okay. Well, so I did a little bit more research. I put them all together into a few pages that I just stapled together. And I think I called it The Good Death Guide, 27 questions to ask and answer before you die, or something like that.
I love it.
And then I put on a local workshop, which I had been used to doing for my other work here, and it filled up just like that. And there was a waiting list as well. So I was like, interesting. So from that point, I felt like I was life itself was grabbing me by the shoulders and showing me which direction to go. And that's what it's been like ever since, actually. So,
wow.
I know, amazing.
And you do have a website called Before I Go Solutions. Talk to me a little bit about what that website, what your or your hope is for that website.
Yeah, it's beforeigosolutions.com. And our purpose, I can say our now because we are a team of people now, but in the beginning it was just me. But the purpose is to have end-of-life plans become as commonplace as birth plans. Now, if that was really happening, there would be no need for our organization, because it would be normal for people to talk about death and have an end-of-life plan, just like we plan for our wedding or a birth or any major transition. However, we're quite far away from that. I don't even know if it'll happen in my lifetime. But here's the thing. Especially in the early days, I got to talk about Philip a lot. And that was really great because people wanted to know the story of what had brought me to this place, because it was even more unusual then, 4 or 5 years ago, than it is now, to talk about this kind of stuff. And but here I was talking about it and feeling that Philip would have been proud of me. And, he was a psychotherapist. His motivation in life was to help people to make a difference in their lives. And here he was, even from the grave, still making a difference in a different kind of way. So, and still today, it feels like that for me. And So I set up Before I Go Solutions as a not-for-profit, and we now, and then I started running groups. Now, strangely enough, I know everything is online these days, but in those days we were online right at the beginning, right from the beginning, because where I live in Scotland, there's not so many people around. So
sounds great to me.
well, I knew that we needed to go online, to run an online course. And so we did that, and we carried on doing that. And that became the Before I Go method, which is my method of how to get people to actually do their end of life plans and not just talk about doing it.
Which is a big difference.
It's a huge difference. It's a huge difference because despite all the good intentions and despite the desire and despite people knowing that they need to do this sort of thing, actually doing it is another matter. And I think that's partly because people are, it never really, doing your end of life plan or even doing your will or a part of your end of life plan doesn't ever really get to the top of your priority list, very rarely. So now also, because people asked me to, I started training people to be end of life plan facilitators. And so we now have more people around the country helping people to do exactly that. Because, all this information about how to plan for a good death and all that, it is all out there on the internet. People can find it. It might not all be in one spot. But still, having the information doesn't make you do it, does it?
Not at all. Not at all.
I know.
Why do you think we have such a hard time talking about end of life? Because, you think about it, we do plan for everything. We plan to move. I just moved to Denver. We plan and we map out books that we're about to write. And plans like that. But when it comes, we tend to talk a lot about, we got to do it. And then we don't, and then something occurs and it becomes like an emotional driven reaction that we find ourselves not making really good decisions in.
Exactly. Exactly.
And we question ourselves because, is that what mom wanted? And just like I have to reference when you talked about Philip answering those questions and the first one, when you knew what he wanted, the peace it must have given you. And I want people to cross this bridge because it feels so good on the other side when you know what you don't know, but I can't get them to do it. So why do you feel we have such a hard time?
Well, I think partly because since death has become more medicalized, i.e. it happens more often in hospitals and outside of the home. So as a child, we don't grow up seeing that, whereas it didn't used to be like that, and not so long ago either. It was much more the case that granny or grandpa would have been living with us or near us, and we would have seen them declining, and they would have died at home, and we would have gone and seen the body, and that was normal. But that doesn't hardly ever happen these days. So there's that. So we're not familiar with it. So it's almost as if we can live our lives pretending that we're not going to die, which is completely bonkers. But anyway,
so bonkers.
But also, I think there's also superstition. People think that if they talk about this, it will somehow bring it to them more quickly. It's all based on fear, really. I think people also are afraid of offending someone. So they don't want to make a mistake. They don't want to cause upset unnecessarily, all of which are, noble things to be thinking, but actually they're not very useful. Because what I've discovered is that when one person, it only takes one person, has the courage to raise this subject, more often than not, in my experience, more often than not, the people that they're talking to are actually, they might be a bit shocked to start with because they're, the D word is being dared to be mentioned, but they're actually relieved underneath, especially if they've been thinking about it as well. So I had that happen with a particular person on a course once. She's the carer of her parents who were both in their 80s. And she was really terrified to the point of tears about how to broach the subject. But we encouraged her and she went away and she came back the next week and she was delighted because she had said something. She had a context that she was on the course. She told her parents and they were relieved as well because they'd been worrying about what to say to her. and they didn't know what to say.
I know. But we do, those who are not exposed to what you and I have been exposed to in our lives, they don't know where to begin. And I think that's why it's so important when it comes to your website and your books, because you actually kind of prompt us, hey, here are some of the questions. And you almost give us permission. And I think that's what people need.
That's true. That's true. And one of the things that you do need, I think, is when you're going to have a conversation about death, is you need to have a context. I mean, just to sort of say it bluntly over the breakfast table one morning is not a good idea unless you have a context. It's like, if you have a context in that, I've been reading this book and it's really interesting, blah, blah, blah. Or I've been doing this course and it's really interesting. This is what I've learned. And I've got some homework and I need to ask you a question. Would you help me with it? Or maybe you know somebody who has died, or you've gone to a funeral, or you've been on a Zoom funeral or something like that. Then there's a context where you can say how you were thinking about it or what you were feeling about it, and ask the other person what they might feel like. Then it's much easier. And trying to do it without a context and out of the blue does not work. So don't even bother trying.
Right. You're right. And, I find one of the contents is when I'm talking to my grandmothers or older individuals, I kind of say, look, I'm planning for my own end of life, and I'm thinking about having my funeral before I die. What do you think about that? And then it opens up, because it's about me.
Yes, exactly.
And then they're like, I don't want that. I'm like, oh, what do you want? And it becomes this kind of evolution of a conversation, not putting anyone on the spot.
Yeah.
So I sort of, even though I have planned for everything, I sort of start with that because it really gives other people permission. So talk to me about your books, and tell me a little bit more about your books and where can people find them?
Okay, so they're you can get them through any bookshop, but also Amazon, of course. The first one was called Gifted by Grief, a true story of cancer, loss and rebirth. And that's exactly what it's about, the journey up to Philip dying in that first year, in his last year. And then my first year after he had died, I think it was maybe a little bit longer than that. And that's a memoir, and I write it as I'm talking now. That's how I'm writing it.
I love it.
And then the second book, and that came out in 2018. That is Before I Go: The Essential Guide to Creating a Good End of Life Plan. And this was one that I began to realize needed to be written, and had written it in my head, but it hadn't made it out onto paper. Until I met an editor at a gathering one day, and I just had the idea to ask her if she would be interested, and that's basically what happened. And funnily enough, it's actually now published by an American publisher. So that book is very different. I still have a kind of chatty style. It's just the way I will always do things, but it's divided.
I love it. A chatty style. I hope I have a chatty style too. I love it.
Well, in that book, it's like there's two halves. The first is the kind of thinking behind why we need to do all this stuff. And then the second half is much more like, it's kind of like a workbook. And if you actually did answer all the questions that are in that workbook, you would have a pretty good end of life plan. However, I suspect most people don't actually do that, but I would love it if they did. Very practical. It's much more practical than Gifted by Grief, which is my own personal journey. It's very personal.
I love it. I want you to come to Denver. I think we need to do something once this whole COVID stuff. I would love to do something with you.
Yes, that would be great.
I think you have just a sweet and approach to very difficult conversations. And the world is so small. And I think the more we work together, the bigger impact we might have.
Yeah.
And so we got to think about that.
I'd love to.
I want to work with you.
Great.
But tell me, how can individuals learn more about you and your platform?
Yeah, best to go to the website beforeigosolutions.com. If you can see the TEDx talk on YouTube, obviously, how to do a good death. Just Google it, it'll come up. But yes, on the website, we have all sorts of things, all the courses. That's where you can get more information about the books. There's some free stuff there as well. I have a knowledge hub, and I'm always doing new things. And if anybody is interested in training as an end-of-life plan facilitator and helping other people, that's also where to find out about that.
Really? So you have courses?
Yes. We have an online course so that you can do your own end-of-life plan with some live coaching. That used to be by me, but now it's by one of our facilitators. But we also we train people to be end-of-life plan facilitators. And actually, I just say it's different from being an end-of-life doula. An end-of-life doula will include the companionship of somebody who is dying. Our work tends to be with people who are not actually who don't actually have a terminal illness or even anywhere near dying, actually, but they are people who are wanting to put in place the plans ahead of time and then get on with living, because that's really important. So that's who the facilitators tend to work with. And yeah, we now have 3 intakes a year. I'm delighted. And it's all online. It's wonderful.
It's so amazing. And that means you can be anywhere you want and still maintain. And it's nothing like planning around this topic right in your living room. And maybe with your partner or husband or whoever.
Yeah.
I think Philip would be so proud of you.
Oh, you know what? That's what I think too. And I was just I was thinking this morning, I was out for a walk, a very snowy walk in the woods, and I was thinking about him. And, because it was 9 years ago now, that's quite a long time. And I've got married again, and we're about to move into our new house. I'm very, very blessed. But I was chatting away to Philip this morning in the woods and saying to him that I felt like, we were getting bigger and bigger and I didn't want to be leaving him behind. And then I realized that I wasn't actually leaving him behind. He's actually behind me. It felt like it, and so I had this little chat with him and I felt all close to him all over again. And it was really lovely.
I think that people only die when we stop allowing them to impact our lives and we stop talking about them.
Yeah.
And, and I love that Philip is still creating his legacy through you.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
I know. I really realized that this morning, in a different way, at a different level. And I felt so good about it, so good. Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing. Jane, I mean, it's just really wonderful to talk to you. And I hope people will go to your website. And I really, really appreciate you coming on and spending some time on this snowy morning in Denver and in Scotland. You're a delight, and I look forward to what we can collaborate on and how we can continue to change how individuals and ourselves find how we live and face end of life. You're amazing.
Thank you. Wonderful. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. And remember, you're the designer. This podcast is produced by Jason Andre with 7 Season Films. If you're interested in telling your story via podcast, look him up.